It's a windy day in the suburbs, and while most people are battling against the gusts, Connie Sumner has her home life in order. She's busy keeping her lively son, Charlie, and her playful, joke-cracking husband, Edward, happy and cared for. Life is good for the Sumners, even with the strong winds shaking up the day. While out trying to hail a cab, Connie struggles against the blustery weather and accidentally bumps into a Frenchman named Paul Martel, who's balancing a pile of books. The collision sends them both tumbling, with Connie landing on Paul. Embarrassed, she apologizes, and despite being flustered, Paul tries and fails to help her find a cab. Frustrated, he curses but lightens the mood with a quick joke. Noticing Connie's scraped legs, Paul offers to let her treat them at his nearby apartment. After a moment's hesitation, she agrees. Paul's place is a surprise, spacious and packed with books, reflecting his work as a book dealer. Once she's cleaned her wounds, Paul offers her tea, but she instead asks to use his phone to call her son. While she's on the call, Paul gently presses an ice-filled cloth to her thigh and guides her hand to hold it. Connie, caught off guard by the gesture, stammers but doesn't address it. After her call, she shares that it was her son on the line. Before leaving, Paul insists she take a book. Following his lead, she picks one and reads a line aloud. Paul joins her, quoting, "Be happy for this moment." Back home, Connie tells Edward about her scrapes and the nice man who helped her get a cab. Edward, ever the jokester, teasingly asks Connie if the man who helped her was handsome and whether she got his name so they can send him some cheap wine. The next day, while at Grand Central Station, Connie decides to call Paul to thank him for his kindness. However, Paul quickly interrupts her and invites her over to his apartment. Despite some hesitation, Connie agrees. At Paul's place, he greets her with his usual dry humor and boyish charm. As he takes her coat, he lets his fingers linger on her skin, a subtle but deliberate touch. Paul then asks her to close her eyes and guides her hand over a Braille book he owns. They laugh together at the book's odd contents, but even when the laughter fades, Paul continues to hold her hands, eventually intertwining his fingers with hers. Smiling nervously, Connie abruptly says she has to leave and makes her way out. Afterwards, Connie heads straight to Edward's office, where she briefly greets one of his employees, Bill. Once alone, she and Edward share a warm, affectionate hug. Out of the blue, Connie gives him a gift, a sweater she jokes makes him look like Bill Gates. Although Edward is busy dealing with issues at his armored truck business, he makes time for her. When he jokingly asks what she was up to, Connie tensely responds, "Bob Gaylord," prompting a laugh from Edward. Later at home, Edward notices Connie seems distracted as she washes dishes but doesn't press her about it. Soon after, Connie visits Paul again. This time, he invites her to dance with him. She hesitates at first but eventually lets herself go, swept away by the music and the intensity of the moment as something deeper stirs between them. While dancing with Paul, Connie teasingly asks him how many girlfriends he's had. He playfully replies, 2. As the moment grows more intimate, Connie's hands begin to explore his body and their lips almost meet until the music skips. The spell breaks and reality rushes in for Connie. Filled with regret and confusion, she says it's a mistake and tries to leave. Paul stops her, saying there are no mistakes, only things you can or can't do. Connie firmly decides she can't do this and walks away. But seconds later, she returns, flustered because she forgot her coat. Without a word, Paul pulls her into his arms. Overwhelmed by her attraction to him, Connie gives in and their passion takes over. On the train ride home, Connie wrestles with guilt and disbelief. Despite her conflicted emotions, she can't help but recall what happened. Paul knew exactly how to awaken her desires, but her inhibitions truly broke when he told her to hit him, coaxing a fiery passion out of her. What started as hesitation soon turned into feverish intensity, pushing them past the point of no return. Meanwhile, Edward runs into Bob Gaylord, the man Connie claimed to be meeting for auction business. When Edward jokingly warns Bob to watch out for her, Bob looks confused and says he's been out of town, leaving Edward puzzled. In the days that follow, Connie lives a double life. She's loving and content with Edward and Charlie, but with Paul, she feels alive and daring, indulging in their heated affair. One day, at a restaurant with Paul, they're spotted by Edward's employee, Bill. Though Connie's affair thrives, her intimacy with Edward suffers as she continues to reject his advances. One morning, despite Edward's best efforts to plan a lunch with her, Connie finds excuse after excuse to avoid it. When Connie tells Edward she has a facial appointment, he eventually gives up trying to have lunch with her. Later, at work, Curiosity gets the better of him, and he calls the salon to confirm her appointment, but learns she never made one. On her way to Paul's apartment, Connie is stopped by her friends Tracy and Sally. Despite her protests, Tracy insists they grab coffee together. While at the cafe, Connie sneaks off to call Paul, asking him to wait for her. Moments later, Paul shows up and heads to the restroom. Connie quickly excuses herself, and the two share a hurried, secretive encounter in the restroom before she returns to the table, acting as if nothing happened. As Paul approaches the counter, Sally comments that she'd give anything for a man like him to notice her. Tracy chides her, reminding her about her husband and kids. Sally dismisses the warning, joking that an affair could just be a fun distraction, like taking a pottery class. The mood turns serious as Tracy, with a heavy tone, warns that affairs are disasters waiting to happen. Her regret is evident as she admits that if she could undo one thing in her life, it would be her own affair. The confession hits Connie hard. Later, back at Paul's apartment, Connie tells him they should end things now before anyone gets hurt. Paul steps closer and says softly that he'd be the one hurt if they stop now, leaving Connie torn. Meanwhile, Edward fires Bill for disloyalty to the company. Bill pleads for his job, citing his family, but Edward coldly replies that they were a family at work. Bill snaps, accusing Edward of not understanding family and suggesting he look at his own before judging others. Edward is left shaken, with a lost expression on his face. Edward, overcome with suspicion, hires a private investigator named Frank to follow Connie. The next day, Edward leaves for a business trip to Chicago, but Connie doesn't even say goodbye. She pretends to be asleep until he leaves. With Edward gone, Connie and Paul grow bolder. They meet more frequently, even hooking up in a movie theater, unaware that Frank is tailing them and capturing everything in photos. Later, Frank presents the evidence to Edward, detailing Connie's affair and who Paul is. Edward silently flips through the photos, utterly devastated. Meanwhile, Connie begins to unravel under the weight of her guilt and the fear of being discovered. She becomes distracted and forgetful, almost failing to pick up Charlie from school. Her emotions boil over, and she breaks down in tears, first in a grocery store, then in her car. Driving recklessly in the rain, she spots Paul with another woman and follows them to a bookstore. Consumed by jealousy, Connie confronts Paul and demands to know who the woman is. Paul, now dealing with a bitter and emotional Connie, takes her back to his apartment. The tension between them is overwhelming. In the heat of the moment, Connie furiously declares the affair over. Paul refuses to let her go and persists, his actions igniting both anger and passion in Connie. Though she fights and says she hates him, they ultimately give in to their emotions, making love in a raw, turbulent way, all while Edward watches silently from outside the apartment. As Connie leaves in a disheveled state, unaware of Edward's presence, he hesitates before entering Paul's building. He knocks on Paul's door, and when Paul answers, Edward's first question is, "How old are you?" Introducing himself as Connie's husband, Edward politely asks to come in. The conversation that follows is tense, awkward, and heavy with unspoken truths. Paul tries to ease the tension by pouring vodka for both of them, while Edward attempts to keep the conversation casual. He politely asks how Paul is, how he met Connie, and if she likes the neighborhood. Paul suggests she probably finds the city more exciting than the suburbs. Stunned, Edward hesitantly asks if Connie talks about him. Paul doesn't respond, and the silence is heavy. Edward wanders into Paul's bedroom, with Paul trailing behind. Edward's gaze falls on the unmade bed, his face clouded with pain. Spotting a snow globe among Paul's belongings, Edward picks it up. The globe plays a tune, and Paul awkwardly confirms it was a gift from Connie. Edward is crushed. Sitting on the bed, he reveals in a trembling voice that the snow globe was originally a gift from him to Connie. Overwhelmed by betrayal, Edward breaks down, his heartache turning into a spiraling confusion. He mutters that he's not feeling well, and Paul, now concerned, steps closer to offer help. In a sudden, uncontrolled moment, Edward swings the snow globe at Paul's head. The blow is fatal, and Paul collapses instantly. Shocked and disoriented, Edward falls back onto the bed, staring at the blood-stained globe in his hand. Horror floods him as he realizes what he's done. Quickly, Edward begins cleaning the crime scene. While doing so, he hears a tearful voicemail from Connie, breaking things off with Paul and admitting she's tired of hurting and lying to her family. Gritting his teeth, Edward wraps Paul's body in a carpet, erases the messages on Paul's phone, and drags the body to his car. After attending Charlie's play and ensuring Connie is asleep, Edward sneaks out at night. He drives to a landfill and disposes of Paul's body. The next day, Edward looks exhausted, and Connie notices, asking if he's okay. He brushes it off but, almost pleadingly, asks if she likes living there, offering to move if she wants. Concerned, Connie reassures him they're staying. Later, police detectives Dean and Moronic arrive at the summer house. They question Connie about Paul, mentioning that her number was found at his desk. They explain Paul's family reported him missing, and his estranged wife doesn't know where he is. Stunned, Connie admits she didn't know Paul was married. She plays it cool, claiming he's just a book dealer she was considering buying from. Satisfied for now, the detectives leave. At a birthday party, Charlie casually mentions the police visit to Edward. Both Edward and Connie act calm, with Connie pretending she barely knew Paul. However, Edward is tormented by memories of what he did. His guilt follows him everywhere, weighing him down. A week and a half later, the detectives return. They inform Connie that Paul's body was found over the weekend. She struggles to maintain her composure as Dean subtly suggests she might know more than she's letting on. After another round of questioning, the detectives leave. Edward, burdened and distant, quietly steps away from Connie. Once alone, she collapses in tears. At a laundromat, Connie finds something in Edward's jacket pocket, photos of her and Paul. The shocking discovery leaves her shattered as everything falls into place. That night, the Sumners host friends at their home. As guests chatter in the living room, Connie struggles to focus. Her unease intensifies when a guest admires their snow globe collection. To her horror, she spots the windy snow globe she had given Paul, the same one Edward used to kill him. Breathing heavily, Connie looks at Edward, who avoids her gaze, guilt written all over his face. After the guests leave, the tension explodes. Connie confronts Edward, demanding to know what he did. Edward, already at his breaking point, fires back, accusing her of betraying him. In a fury, he asks if she thought he wouldn't notice her affair. He rages about how she threw away their life for some kid, recounting the pain of realizing her infidelity. Edward's anger boils over, and he admits he didn't want to kill Paul, he wanted to kill her. The weight of his words crushes Connie. The horrifying truth that her husband is a murderer leaves her reeling, and she looks like she might be sick. Overwhelmed, she walks away, leaving Edward to collapse into his grief. The next morning is deceptively calm. Charlie and Edward play the piano together while Connie flips through their family album, her face a mix of sorrow and disbelief. Edward pauses during the music to pull Charlie close, savoring the fleeting peace. Suddenly, the sound of police sirens echoes from outside. Connie and Edward exchange a tense, knowing glance while Charlie remains blissfully unaware. After a moment, Edward resumes playing the piano, holding onto the last thread of normalcy in a life that's already fallen apart. Connie picks up the Windy City snow globe and fiddles with it. She plays its tune, but it sounds stuck. Curious, she opens the globe and finds a small envelope inside. Written on it are the words, "If found, do not open until our 25th anniversary, dated 1993. Inside the envelope, she finds a photograph of the two of them with baby Charlie. On the back, Edward had written, "To my beautiful wife, the best part of every day." Connie's eyes fill with tears as she and Edward share a pained, silent look, the piano music echoing faintly in the background. Later, Connie burns all the photographs Frank took of her and Paul. As the pictures curl in the flames, she imagines a different choice, one where she hailed a cab the day Paul invited her in. In this version, they part ways with a smile, and Paul lives. Edward approaches her as she's lost in thought. When Connie admits she's scared, Edward calmly tells her he'll turn himself in. She immediately refuses, clutching him tightly. He holds her close as she promises that no one will ever know. Edward, weary, replies, "We'll know." Connie leans into him, crying as the weight of their shared secret presses down on them. Though they try to move forward, guilt haunts their every moment. During a dance, they can't even bring themselves to kiss, the distance between them growing with the burden they carry. The pain culminates while driving one evening. At a red light, with Charlie asleep in the back seat, Connie brings up the idea of leaving the country, starting anew. Edward, his humor briefly flickering back, calls her señorita. Connie softly smiles, mentioning Mexico as they sit in their fragile bubble of hope, trying to imagine a future free of their past. Connie continues, her voice trembling as she paints a picture of a new life. She talks about living near a beach, learning to play the guitar, and Edward serenading her every night until she falls asleep. Edward smiles softly and promises her he will. Finally, Connie asks him what he thinks about her dream. Edward gazes at her for a moment and replies simply, "It sounds perfect." Hearing this, Connie breaks down, the weight of everything too much to bear. She weeps in his arms, and Edward holds her tightly, kissing her as they cling to each other in their shared grief and guilt. But as their embrace lingers, the light ahead turns green. The camera pulls back, revealing their car parked outside a police station. The truth looms large, and the choice they must make feels inevitable.